Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to continue our look at how British tactics developed in World War I. In the last video, we looked at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March 1915, where the initial phase of the British attack was very successful due to scripted infantry-artillery coordination. Here, we're going to jump forward a year and a half to a British battalion attack on the Somme on the 3rd of September 1916 to get a lower level look at this kind of attack. The battalion in question is 4th Battalion Duke of Wellington's Regiment, otherwise known as 4th DWR. This was a territorial battalion that didn't go to France with the BEF, instead arriving in April 1915, and although it participated in some heavy defensive fighting around Ypres, particularly in October, the attack we're going to cover is its first major offensive action. A bit like the video on Mons, I'm really leaning on one account of this, the history of the 4th Battalion Duke of Wellington's West Riding Regiment 1914 to 1919 by Captain P.G. Bales, who served as the battalion intelligence officer, assistant adjutant, and then adjutant, and kept the battalion's war diary for 2 years. It's a really good read, and I'd highly recommend it. But relying heavily on a single source is not tremendously good history, and it could certainly be argued that Captain Bales is unlikely to portray his own battalion in a negative light. On the other hand, this is a tiny fragment of a gigantic battle, it's well written, and it uses the German after-action report as an additional source, plus it fits neatly into the narrative of World War I tactical development. In other words, if it's not 100% accurate, it's accurate enough for our purposes here. It's no real surprise that this is 4DWR's first big attack. The Battle of the Somme was one of the major battles of the war, lasting 5 months and involving, at one time or another, essentially the entire BEF. An Allied attack had been planned on the Somme, at the boundary between the French and British lines, for some time, though the Germans preempted it with their offensive at Verdun. As a result, the French commitment to the Somme decreased as Verdun sucked in more and more units, increasing not only the British commitment to the Somme battle, but the need to prosecute it in order to take pressure off the French. In very general terms, the attack went in on the 1st of July after significant preparations, including a massive week-long preparatory bombardment intended to comprehensively annihilate the German defences. This had been enabled by both a massive expansion of the British Army and a massive expansion of Britain's artillery ammunition manufacturing capacity. Unfortunately for the British, not only has this manufacturing capacity increase naturally resulted in a decrease in quality, and there are a lot of dud shells, but the Germans are dug in on a series of chalk ridges suitable for deep shelters capable of resisting even direct hits from heavy artillery. As a result, when the bombardment stops, the Germans are able to swarm out of their shelters and, in many cases, stop the advancing British troops in no man's land. Although the Allies make some early gains, many of these are soon lost to German counterattacks. Despite this setback on the first day, the British keep the attack going with smaller, more focused operations along the front, and by September had made some progress. On the northern section of front, however, the front lines were still pretty much where they had been at the start of the battle, and inevitably another attack was ordered. Part of the reason for the delay in the north is that more preparations were in hand. The British had decided that no man's land here was too wide to cross quickly enough for success, so they started to build a series of parallels out in front of their trenches to serve as a closer jumping off point. 4 DWIs in the line at this point, and they're tasked with providing covering parties in no man's land to protect the work parties digging the parallels at night. The attack itself is carefully planned out. The 49th Division's 146th and 147th Brigades are to attack northeast from Thiepval Wood. In 147th Brigade, the 5th DWR is to attack on the left, and 4 DWR on the right, with 7 DWR in reserve. This means that 4 DWR is on the far right edge of the attack with no support on its right, which factors into the plan. The battalion's B Company is to lead, aiming to seize the German frontline trench from points 84 to 54. Following them up, A Company is to pass through and attack the German support line beyond, from points 95 to 66, and specifically create a block on the Munster Gas communications trench. D Company is on the right and tasked with securing the right flank of the attack by seizing points 84 to 95 along a communications trench linking the German front and support lines. The Battalion C Company is to remain in reserve. The attack is planned to start at 05:10, so it's a dawn attack with a hurricane bombardment. This will spend 3 minutes on the German front line, then move on to the support line, where it will continue for another 8 minutes. In other words, we have timetabled infantry-artillery integration for a limited bite and hold attack, at least from 4DWR's perspective. So this is very much like the first phase of the Neuve-Chapelle battle. The battalion is pulled out of the line to prepare for the attack, amongst other things conducting rehearsals on a taped-out reproduction of the German trench system. At 05:10 on the 3rd of September, the bombardment starts and 4DWR go over the top. There are 4 platoons in each company, and it looks like B Company attacked with all 4 platoons in one wave, while A and D companies behind it attacked with 2 waves of 2 platoons. As soon as the bombardment starts, the Germans start launching flares, and very quickly, after leaving the trenches, the battalion comes under machine gun fire from enemy positions in the Pope's Nose, to their left, and the Schwaben Redoubt Plus, presumably positioned south of it, to the right. 4DWR starts taking casualties as it moves up the slope towards its objectives. This is pretty steep to begin with, and the ground has been worked over by both sides' artillery for months now, so it's hard going through all the craters. B Company gets to within a few yards of the German front line and stops, waiting for the artillery to lift so they can rush it. Under fire and in the half-light of dawn, the following companies don't see B Company stop and they run into the back of them, getting tangled up in the process. The bombardment lifts, shifting onto the support line, and B Company, plus some men from the other companies who are now mixed in, charge, quickly seizing the front line, or at least what's left of it. Just like No Man's Land, this area has been thoroughly pulverized by artillery, and it's not entirely clear where the trench actually is. Regardless, B Company starts bombing what German dugouts it can find, with some elements working down the German line mopping up, while others start to consolidate in the trench and the craters around it. Meanwhile, A and D companies pass through and press on to their objectives. Somewhat. A Company certainly appears to have advanced in the right direction, bringing along with it some men from the other 2 companies, but D Company apparently goes, or has already gone, off course. Another element of the shell-blasted terrain is that there are no landmarks to reference, and it's very difficult to keep direction. This hasn't been helped by the geometry of the attack. Despite the name, the parallels that 4DWR has started from aren't parallel to the section of front they're slated to attack, and because they're attacking in linear formations, the battalion has had to pivot in No Man's Land in order to align themselves with their angle of attack. B Company is already somewhat further to the left than intended. Instead of seizing the front line between points 54 and 84, it appears that they're centered on point 54 instead. D Company appears to have drifted right instead, which would make sense because they're supposed to be turning right to secure that flank, and instead of taking and holding the communication trench from points 84 to 95, it looks like they've ploughed into the German positions beneath the Schwaben Redoubt. A Company, meanwhile, have advanced up to the edge of the barrage on the German support line. They've also probably drifted a little left, potentially because they were following B Company more closely than D Company was. Now that they're in position to try and rush the support line when the bombardment ends, they get down and wait. Already they've lost a lot of men, and there is only 1 officer left, a Lieutenant Everett. The Germans in the support line are fighting back, even before the bombardment lifts, possibly because they're spread out in the surrounding craters as well as what remains of the actual trench line. It's too hot for A Company to punch forward, so Lieutenant Everett makes a quick reconnaissance and orders the company to charge after one of the attached Lewis guns has emptied its magazine at the defenders. The Lewis gun represents a major increase in attacking firepower for the British infantry. Everyone in the war has machine guns, and in ever-increasing numbers, but these are predominantly heavy, tripod-mounted, water-cooled weapons that are the kind of thing that is technically man-portable, but not something you can practically lug across No Man's Land for an attack. The Lewis gun is admittedly about the same weight as the Vickers itself, but it's not necessary to carry into battle all the things that make the Vickers work effectively, so no water, no tripod, and not box after box after box of ammunition. It's a light machine gun, being air-cooled, firing from an integral bipod, using drum magazines instead of belts, and the infantry can take it with them when they're on the offensive. This allows them to get some machine guns into position quickly to defend ground they've seized, but it also enables them on the attack. A long burst from the Lewis gun suppresses the German infantry in the support line, and A Company follows it up by storming the position. Dugouts are bombed, prisoners taken, and A Company expands down the line in both directions, mopping up and clearing as it goes. There are only 40 men left at this point, out of the 130 that started out. Regardless, 4DWR has conducted a successful, if costly, attack by this point. B and A companies are consolidating on the German front and support lines respectively. They're not exactly where they were planned to be, but the lines to either side of them are clear of German troops for some distance, and while D Company is probably not where it's supposed to be, it is in the German trenches on the right flank of the battalion, as intended. Behind them, though, no man's land has been completely blocked by German counter-artillery. This is pre-registered fire that started falling about 10 minutes into the attack, and while it's mostly focused on the parallels and the British front line, it is basically impenetrable. A, B and D companies have been totally isolated. They can't get any reinforcements, they can't be resupplied, they can't communicate, and only a handful of all the wounded and prisoners sent back across no man's land make it. This has serious consequences. The companies are still under machine gun and rifle fire from other German positions in depth, like the Schwaben Redoubt and the Pope's Nose. The Pope's Nose in particular is problematic because it should have been stormed by 5DWR on the left. This attack has failed, which has not only meant that the German positions there remain to fire into the flanks of 4DWR, but this area was also where the main resupply route to the assault troops was. Another trench, the East Coily Sap, runs almost all the way up to the German front line, and the intention was to use this to quickly establish a relatively safe supply route. This may not have been much direct help to 4DWR, but it would have helped the 5DWR consolidate effectively had the Pope's Nose been taken, thus relieving pressure on 4DWR's left. Unfortunately, the attack failed and the East Coily Sap was effectively blocked by 5DWR's casualties. In fact, there are more 5DWR troops in the front line mixed up with the edge of B Company now than there are in their objective of the Pope's Nose. So although 4DWR has had some success, it's been isolated by the enemy's artillery, it's running low on all kinds of ammunition, has suffered heavy casualties, and is still under fire from left and right. After a few hours, by about 0800, the Germans begin to organise counterattacks. A Company, which is now spread out in a series of posts rather than a continuous line because they simply don't have the manpower, tries to fend off Germans advancing down and on either side of the Munster Gas, but by this time they simply don't have the ammunition or hand grenades to stop them. The post at point 86 is bombed, flanked and then stormed, with the British troops there all being killed, wounded or taken prisoner. Because of the non-continuous nature of A Company's positions, the first the other posts know about this is when the Germans start bombing their way along the support line. Forced to fall back, A Company finds itself squeezed as another German counter-attacking party works its way towards them from the other flank as well. They withdraw back to the German front line via a communication trench, only to find that B Company is in just as bad a position, having been exposed to enemy artillery and machine gun fire for hours. After pushing towards the Pope's Nose and finding another German counterattack bombing its way towards them from that direction, Lieutenant Everett evidently decided that they could do no more and ordered the withdrawal back to the parallels. Barely any of 4DWR make it back across no man's land through the artillery and machine gun fire. Somewhere on the right, D Company suffered a similar fate, running out of ammunition, being forced to fall back and being destroyed between the front lines. So 4DWR's attack has failed, the battalion having lost 347 men out of 647. It's taken out of the line that evening, though a party from C Company, which has still suffered casualties from the German counter-barrage despite remaining in reserve, stays in place. Wounded and stragglers are still trickling in as they make their way back across no man's land, and the party goes out once darkness falls to see if they can find any more. So, why didn't the attack succeed, even though 4DWR essentially reached its objectives? In the last video, I argued that infantry-artillery coordination was the big deal, that the communications technology of the time meant that this coordination could only be achieved by scripting it in advance, and that when events diverged from the script, an attack would fail. To some extent, this attack is an example of that Neuve-Chapelle-style coordination failing. 4DWR certainly stuck close to their barrage and were in position to exploit its suppressive effect immediately after it lifted. This worked for B Company as it stormed the German frontline trench, and while A Company wasn't able to rush the support line off the back of the barrage, they were in the right place to do so. So this element of the script seems to have worked. The infantry was able to keep pace with the artillery. What appears to have not worked so well is the effectiveness of that artillery. Although the front line seems to have been effectively suppressed, there were clearly enough German defenders in the support line to stop A Company from storming it the moment the barrage lifted. It would appear that the artillery didn't destroy or adequately suppress them. One potential explanation for this is that the barrage simply wasn't heavy, accurate, or concentrated enough to do its job. Artillery used for this kind of infantry close support by necessity has to be light in order to reduce the danger area for the assault troops, and German deep shelters on the Somme were famously resilient to even heavy artillery. So this kind of supporting barrage was unlikely to inflict casualties on any German troops hiding underground. It was much more intended to suppress them, keeping them down in their dugouts until suddenly lifting, at which point the attackers would storm the trench before the defenders could deploy. The account suggests that A Company was facing resistance while the barrage was still going, so either there were enough German defenders above ground in the support line or the craters around it to delay A Company until troops underground could get out when the barrage lifted, or A Company was stopped from exploiting the barrage by machine gun fire from other positions on its flanks or in depth. Naturally, it could be both, but the fire from German positions in the Pope's Nose or the Schwaben Redoubt illustrates another aspect necessary for an effective fire plan. It's not enough for the bombardment to hit the enemy trenches that the assault troops are attacking. It also needs to hit the enemy's supporting positions and destroy or suppress them too. This was somewhat in evidence at Neuve-Chapelle when the barrage failed in a few areas, but in that case the flat terrain restricted the ability of German defensive positions in depth to support their forward positions. At the Somme, the Germans are dug into a series of great ridges, in this case on a wide forward slope, giving them many opportunities to sight positions in the rear that can provide direct fire support to positions in front. Here on the 3rd of September, this allowed the defenders to maintain enough unsuppressed machine guns to inflict heavy casualties on 4DWR's attack, and to keep inflicting casualties as the battalion tried to consolidate. This helped to weaken the battalion and set up the success for the German counterattacks. In a similar vein, probably the decisive element of the defence was the German counter-barrage. Just as artillery is key to the attack, it's key to the defence, and has the added advantage that infantry-artillery coordination is a lot easier when the infantry is static and just needs a protective curtain out in no man's land. Communicating to the artillery from the relative safety of the front lines, using telephone lines or signal flares, is also obviously easier than communicating back across a fire-swept no man's land in the attack. In this attack, the German counter-barrage stopped 4DWR from getting reinforced or resupplied, it stopped it communicating with its battalion HQ, and in the end, punished it when it tried to evacuate. This adds further targets to the fire plan if the attack is going to be successful. Not only the enemy supporting positions in depth need to be suppressed, but the enemy's artillery needs to be located and neutralized as well. In other words, in order to support even a relatively small-scale attack, or a small part of a larger attack, the artillery must plaster the enemy lines to be attacked, suppress enemy positions in depth, and perform counter-battery fire to prevent enemy artillery from putting down an effective counter-barrage. To do this, the fire planners need to have an accurate and up-to-date picture of where all these enemy positions are. The deeper enemy positions and his artillery can only be found and plotted through a combination of flash spotting, sound ranging, and especially aerial reconnaissance, which in turn necessitates a degree of freedom of action in the air that can only be won by aerial combat. The TLDR to this is that the battlefield is extending way beyond the front line, with different elements of the combined arms team contributing to the battle in depth in order to enable the infantry at the point of contact. It's the beginning of the deep battle. Infantry-artillery coordination is still the key to success on the battlefield, but as the war goes on and the German defensive systems react and improve, the Allies in turn have to increase the amount of artillery they use and create more extensive fire plans to direct it effectively. That's a lot about the artillery. What about the infantry? From the attacking perspective, we're still looking at linear infantry formations. This makes some practical organisational sense. Attacking infantry begins in relatively linear assault trenches and attacks relatively linear enemy trenches. Linearity also represents continuity. For centuries, infantry have fought in lines, to the point of being referred to as line infantry, because lines maximise frontal firepower and because it's a formation that's easy to understand, teach, and control. However, attacking in lines always has some significant problems on the new firepower-dominated battlefield. Some of these are obvious, like the vulnerability of linear formations to effective enfilade fire if caught by flanking positions, while some have more to do with command control and flexibility. Each of 4 DWR's companies in this attack consisted of 127 men and 3 officers. Arranged in a single line with spacings of 1 metre between each man, this makes for a line about 130 metres long, with each officer controlling about 45 metres. Of course, having 1 metre spacings is catastrophically too close on the modern battlefield, but increasing it also increases the length of line each officer must control. Doubling spacings to 2 metres, still woefully inadequate, means officers are responsible for 90 metres of line, which is not really practical. More responsibility is gradually descending onto the NCOs, the sergeants and the corporals, but simply put, dispersed lines are not efficient for command and control. In order to organise A Company's storming of the support line, Lieutenant Everett and 2 sergeants had to crawl up and down the line of the company in the middle of a firefight. This is not a quick and effective way to communicate orders. In a similar vein, the reorientation of all 3 companies after leaving the parallels at the start of the attack to align the waves with their objectives was fraught with problems. Pivoting a line of men a couple of 100 metres long in the dark under fire on a cratered hillside is not easy, especially when there are no landmarks to align on. In the event, the companies became mixed up and lost direction to varying degrees. This isn't to say that they would not have had issues changing direction after leaving the parallels if they were not organised into lines, rather that trying to create and maintain lines under those circumstances probably made it an awful lot more difficult. Certainly after the Somme, the British make some sweeping official changes to their infantry organisation with less emphasis on linearity, especially with regards to follow-on forces and open or semi-open warfare. Some of the difficulties of linear formations raise an interesting point. One of the primary advantages of operating in lines is that frontal firepower is maximised, but if the infantry is relying on the artillery to provide most of the firepower it needs to advance, how much does the infantry's own organic firepower actually matter? Essentially, the infantry are always likely to encounter some surviving defenders after the barrage is lifted, so although the artillery is capable of breaking the back of an enemy defence, there will inevitably be some knots of resistance that need to be dealt with. The infantry might not be able to compete with the destructive firepower of the artillery, but the more organic firepower they can bring to the fight, the easier time they will have against what's left, whether they have to fight it in the trenches themselves, from crater to crater, or out in the open. And it's important to note that the British infantry's organic firepower has increased since Neuve-Chapelle. There are now 2 or 3 Lewis guns per company, hand grenades are becoming less specialist and more ubiquitous, rifle grenades have reached the front, and machine guns and mortars are becoming more prevalent. A Company was certainly able to perform some organic fire and manoeuvre attacking the support line, designating a Lewis gun to suppress the enemy before the riflemen penetrated the position and then cleared it with hand grenades, rifles and bayonets. On the other side of the wire, firepower in the defence has also changed from Neuve-Chapelle. Earlier in the war, with infantry units based around large numbers of riflemen and small numbers of machine guns, defences had to align with that organisation. So extensive trench systems were required, and they needed to be stacked with massed riflemen to generate the firepower necessary for defence. As the war progresses, however, and British attacks usually begin by obliterating whole sections of trench, this approach becomes a problem. Filling trenches full of men is a good way to get them all killed. Reversing the defence to one based on machine guns supplemented by riflemen means that a high level of firepower is maintained with fewer men in the line. These machine gun teams can be spread out and well dug in or sheltered to mitigate the effects of the initial bombardment, and only a few of them have to survive to win the race to the parapet to seriously jeopardise an attack. This lower manpower approach not only reduces casualties in the front line, but allows units to maintain a stronger reserve for the counterattacks that feature prominently in German doctrine. With counter-barrages by the artillery factored in, we have a combined arms defence. Machine guns slow down and weaken the attacking force, artillery isolates them from support and reinforcements, then counter-attacking infantry, heavily armed with hand grenades, destroy them. Or pretty much exactly what happened on the 3rd of September to 4 DWR. This is late war German defensive doctrine in a nutshell, though it's probably more the result of circumstances here than a conscious top-down decision. This attack was just a small component of the overall Somme battle though, which itself ended on the 18th of November 1916 after 141 days. The Allied offensive had pushed a 9.7 kilometre bulge into the German lines, but not broken through, and while it certainly had some effect on the Battle of Verdun to the south, exactly to what extent it relieved pressure on the French is arguable. Casualties were infamously heavy. Estimates naturally vary by source, but the Allies sustained about 600,000, while the Germans sustained around 440,000. For the BEF, the battle marks a turning point in the war. As painful and expensive in lives as the Somme was, the British Army not only learnt to attack in the conditions of modern warfare at the continental scale, but it was also a major component in the attritional struggle. The Allies, backed up by worldwide empires and the industry of the United States, could ultimately withstand the heavy losses of the Somme and Verdun much better than the limited resources of the Axis powers, and the stage is set for the Allied offensives of 1917, where the challenge and response dynamic continues, and both sides attempt to apply what they've learned. Hope you all found this one interesting, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.